Lieutenant Mara Keene crouched behind a jagged rock formation, her breathing steady but quiet. Around her, the alien world stretched in sharp contrasts. Red deserts cut through pale green forests, and jagged cliffs rose like broken teeth from the ground. The sky was a deep, dark violet, streaked with strange, glittering clouds. Mara had been here for only a few hours, but every sense in her body was alive with awareness. She was not alone, and she was being hunted. Her mind replayed the attack that brought her here. The Wayfarer's Wake, humanity's deep space exploration vessel, had been cruising at the edge of a disputed system when the Apex Conquered arrived. They were large, intelligent predators, believing themselves to be the natural rulers of the stars. Their ships moved with purpose and precision, their weapons designed not just to destroy but to intimidate. To them, humans were fragile, unpredictable creatures, perfect for sport. The attack had been swift. Mara remembered the screams echoing in the corridors, alarms blaring, lights flickering. She had run, ducking and dodging through maintenance tunnels until she found a small escape pod. She had no idea if anyone else had survived. When her pod touched down on this hostile planet, she realized the Apex hunters had left her intentionally. They wanted to see how a human would survive with nothing but a suit, 10 energy rounds, and a simple knife. 10 rounds, she muttered quietly, checking the small counter on her blaster. 10. It was almost nothing but enough. Enough to make a difference if she used them wisely. She ran her fingers over the knife's handle. Steel and carbon fiber, light, reliable, her last resort. The Apex believed they had won. They were confident. That was their mistake. Mara moved carefully through the jagged landscape. Every footstep was measured. Every sound was analyzed. The predators had scanners, but they were not perfect. The humans had something the Apex did not: instinct, improvisation, and the will to survive. Mara had trained for situations like this. She had studied alien behavior and she had studied herself. Fear was a tool. Control was everything. Hours passed. The sun, a pale green disk in the violet sky, began to sink behind the cliffs. Mara found a small cave at the base of a rock face. It was narrow, but it would provide shelter for the night. She checked the interior carefully, scanning for any signs of danger. None. She allowed herself a small breath of relief. Sitting inside the cave, Mara began to ration her supplies. A small package of protein cubes, enough water for a few days, the energy rounds carefully stored in a belt pouch. She examined the knife again, testing its balance, imagining scenarios in which she might need to use it. This was not a weapon of pride. It was a tool, a lifeline. She had survived simulations, drills, and field missions that would have broken others. Now her survival depended not on training alone, but on understanding the environment, the enemy, and herself. The first night was cold. Mara wrapped herself in the survival suit, the temperature regulator humming softly against the alien chill. She listened for movement outside, for the sound of footsteps on rock or the distant hum of hovercrafts. There was nothing. For now the hunters waited, thinking the human would panic. Mara smiled faintly. Patience was a human strength. She had time. They did not. By morning, Mara had a plan. The Apex Conquered believed in overwhelming force. They believed in their superior numbers, their technology, their strength. They did not understand subtlety, observation, or adaptability. Mara moved quietly through the rocks, observing animal life, alien plants, and terrain features. She made mental notes, mapping paths and hiding spots. She understood the hunters would strike first at what they considered easy prey. She would be neither. Her first encounter came at midday. A scouting drone, sleek and glimmering, hovered above a ridge, scanning the terrain. Mara froze, hidden behind a large boulder. The drone's sensors flickered as she observed it. Using a small rock, she managed to create a distraction, a tumble of stones that drew its attention away from her. When the drone turned, she was already moving to a safer position. One down, she thought quietly. one small step towards survival. As the day went on, Mara explored further. She discovered a small stream running through a narrow canyon. Water was life, and this stream could sustain her. She drank carefully, tasted the minerals, and considered how she could use the terrain to her advantage. Narrow canyons could funnel the hunters, strange plant life could trip sensors, and cliffs could hide ambush points. Everything was a tool if used wisely. By the second day, Mara had begun to leave small signals for herself, marks on rocks, arrangements of stones, anything that might guide her if she needed to retreat quickly. She was learning the rhythm of the planet, its winds, its creatures, and even the way shadows moved. The Apex had assumed they controlled the situation. Mara was rewriting the rules. Late in the afternoon, she encountered her first real threat. A group of apex hunters moved down a ridge, their armored suits gleaming in the pale sunlight. They were scanning, searching, confident. Mara observed from a hidden vantage point, noting their formations and communication patterns. They moved predictably, relying on technology and brute force. She did not panic. She waited. When one of the hunters moved slightly ahead of the others, she activated a small, improvised trap, rolling a boulder onto a narrow path below. It was enough to delay them, to disrupt their formation. Mara watched from above as they regrouped, frustrated but unharmed. She had no intention of fighting yet. Her goal was survival, not confrontation. The Apex did not understand restraint. They believed that aggression was always the answer. That was their weakness. Night came again, and Mara returned to the cave. Her body was tired, but her mind was sharp. She ate sparingly, drank from her small water pouch, and began reviewing her mental map of the terrain. She thought about the Apex, about what they expected from her, and about what she could do to survive. Humanity had always thrived not because of strength alone, but because of intelligence, adaptability, and determination. She would prove it. Over the next few days, Mara began to implement small strategies. She moved only when necessary, avoided direct contact, and used the environment to her advantage. She observed the hunters' patterns, noting where they made mistakes, where they assumed control, and where they underestimated her. Every small action, avoiding detection, setting distractions, finding food and water, was a test, a rehearsal for the greater challenge ahead. On the fifth day, she encountered the first sign of another human. A small, abandoned exploration pod lay hidden in a canyon, damaged but mostly intact. Mara inspected it carefully. Inside, she found rations, water, and a few tools left by someone who had clearly tried to survive. No other signs of life remained. She took what she could carry and left the rest. Every resource mattered. Every advantage counted. By the sixth day, Mara had become almost invisible. The hunters grew frustrated, moving faster, communicating more urgently. Mara observed them, learning their methods, predicting their moves. She had 10 rounds left, one knife, and a growing confidence in her ability to outsmart them. The Apex had underestimated human ingenuity, and that would be their greatest mistake. The sun set on the sixth day, painting the alien sky in shades of violet and orange. Mara sat on a ridge, watching the horizon, thinking of the days ahead. She would not simply survive, she would adapt, she would endure, and she would turn the hunt into her own advantage. The Apex had believed they held all the power. Mara smiled faintly. Power was relative. Intelligence, patience, and courage were far stronger. Her plan was taking shape. She would lead the hunters into traps, use the terrain to her advantage, and make every round, every action, every decision count. She would not allow herself to be prey. Humanity had always faced overwhelming odds, and humanity had always found a way to endure. Mara Keen would prove that, here on this alien world, the Apex conquered had made a terrible miscalculation. And Mara was just getting started. The alien world was quiet now, but Mara Keen knew better than to trust the silence. She moved carefully along a narrow canyon, her boots crunching lightly on the red gravel. Her eyes scanned every crevice, every shadow. The apex-conquered hunters were out there, searching for her. They had underestimated a human once, and now she planned to show them why that was a mistake. Mara paused to look at the terrain ahead. The canyon narrowed sharply, forming a natural corridor between jagged cliffs. Perfect. She crouched low, studying the patterns of the winds and the alien flora. Some of the plants were reactive. They moved slightly when something passed nearby. Mara had observed this on previous days and knew she could use it. She arranged some rocks and branches near the narrow entrance, forming a subtle trap. The hunters would not notice until it was too late. A low hum reached her ears, a patrol drone scanning the area. Mara froze, her heart steady but alert. The drone hovered closer, its sensors sweeping. She waited until it passed her hiding spot, then moved quickly along the canyon wall, keeping out of sight. Every step, every decision mattered. Survival was not about speed, it was about control, and Mara had control. By midday, Mara had found a small plateau overlooking the canyon. From here, she could observe the movements of the apex hunters below. She counted 5 of them, all heavily armored, moving in careful formations. They were confident, speaking in sharp clicks and hums that she did not understand, but she could read their intentions. Their overconfidence would be their weakness. Mara's first move was simple. She pulled one of the energy rounds from her belt and loaded it into her blaster. Not to attack, yet, but to send a signal. She fired it into a narrow rock crevice. The shot ricocheted loudly, echoing through the canyon. Immediately, the hunters paused, looking around for the source. Mara watched silently from above as they began to split up, trying to cover more ground. Exactly what she had hoped for. Using the distraction, Mara moved along the cliffs, placing small markers of stones to guide her retreat if necessary. She had learned that in the alien world every detail mattered. The wind, the light, the movement of creatures, all could be used to her advantage. She climbed carefully, avoiding loose rocks until she reached a high ledge overlooking the hunters again. From this vantage point, she could plan her next step. The apex hunters continued down the canyon, unaware that Mara was leading them into a trap. She had noticed a small cluster of alien plants along the narrow path below, vines that, when disturbed, released a thick, sticky sap. Not lethal, but enough to slow movement and obscure sensors. Mara had spent days observing these plants and had carefully placed small rocks and sticks to guide the hunters directly through the patch. It was time to see her plan in action. The hunters moved cautiously, stepping where they believed it was safe. Then, one by one, their boots sank slightly into the sticky sap. Sensors began to fail, their formation collapsed, and communication became fragmented. Mara observed silently, a small smile forming on her face. One of the hunters tried to charge ahead, but the sap slowed him, and he had to retreat. The hunters were frustrated, moving faster but less coordinated. They were human prey in an alien trap, but this prey was no ordinary human. Mara did not attack directly. She had learned that the apex relied on brute force and technology. If she could force them into mistakes, she could turn their strength against them. One by one, the hunters fell behind, forced to deal with the terrain, the plants, and the environment. Mara's patience was her weapon. The more she waited, the more mistakes they made. Night fell again. Mara returned to a small cave she had discovered earlier, hidden beneath a rocky outcrop. She had enough water and protein cubes to last a few days, but she also knew she could forage for more. The alien world was harsh, but it offered resources for those who observed carefully. She drank sparingly, checked her blaster, and thought about the next moves. 10 rounds had already been reduced by 1. Every shot mattered. Every decision could tip the balance. The following day, Mara decided to take a more daring step. She knew the apex would continue their patrols, but she also knew their sensors and patterns were predictable. Using her knowledge of the terrain, she created a false trail. She scattered small pieces of alien rock and vegetation, leaving signs that suggested she had moved in one direction while she took a hidden path along the cliffs. The hunters followed the false trail immediately, leaving their original position. Mara watched from above, hiding among the shadows, her mind calm and focused. By the third day, Mara's strategy began to pay off in larger ways. The hunters were exhausted, frustrated, and increasingly careless. Mara used the environment to her advantage again. A small group of the apex moved too close to a canyon edge, and she triggered a series of rocks to tumble, cutting off their path. No one was hurt, but their confidence shattered. The apex did not understand restraint. To Mara, restraint was survival. Mara continued to use her limited ammunition sparingly. A single energy round fired into a high rock formation created an echo that confused the hunters' sensors. Another shot sent a small rock tumbling into the canyon, forcing them to pause. By combining patience, observation, and tactical thinking, she turned 10 rounds into a psychological advantage. The apex began to hesitate, unsure of where she might strike next. The hunter had become the hunted, at least in perception. Over the next 2 days, Mara expanded her territory. She moved further from her cave, exploring alien forests, streams, and cliffs. She noted every feature that could be useful, every narrow path and hidden nook. She was learning the rhythm of this world, the movement of creatures, the change of light, the behavior of plants. Everything became a tool in her arsenal. She was no longer merely surviving. She was preparing for the moment when she would turn the hunt completely in her favor. Mara also began to observe the apex hunters more closely. They were intelligent, disciplined, and physically powerful, but they lacked human adaptability. They assumed rules, relied on numbers, and expected obedience from the environment. Mara understood that she did not need to fight them directly. She only needed to guide, manipulate, and outthink them. Every delay, every distraction, every careful move weakened their confidence and strengthened her advantage. By the 6th day, Mara had reached a point of quiet confidence. She had survived several encounters without using more than a few energy rounds. She had avoided direct combat and forced the hunters to make mistakes. She had learned the language of the land, and she had learned the patterns of her enemies. She knew that the real challenge was coming, the moment when she could no longer hide. But she also knew that humans had always thrived in adversity. Patience, intelligence, and courage were stronger than any armor or weapon. The 7th night on the alien world was clear. Mara sat on a high cliff watching the horizon. The sun, a pale green disk in the violet sky, sank slowly, casting long shadows across the terrain. Below, she could see the lights of the apex hunters moving cautiously. They were wary now, aware that they were being outmaneuvered but unable to locate her. Mara smiled faintly. They had assumed they were in control. They had assumed that humans could be hunted easily. They had underestimated her and humanity itself. She thought about the days ahead. She would continue to observe, to learn, to adapt. She would lead the hunters into traps, force them into mistakes, and conserve every resource. Her 10 energy rounds were precious, and she would use each one only when it truly mattered. Her knife remained a last line of defense, a tool that symbolized human resilience. Mara's plan was becoming clearer. The hunters believed the game was theirs. Mara knew better. The hunt was turning, slowly, carefully, in her favor. The apex had underestimated the human capacity for patience, observation, and strategy. And now, the human hunter was ready to show them what that meant. As night fell completely, Mara secured herself in the cave, listening to the alien sounds of the world outside. The wind moved through the rocks, the plants shifted slightly, and distant creatures called to one another. Mara's mind was alive with possibilities. Every detail mattered. Every action could tip the balance. She was not afraid, she was ready. And she knew one thing with absolute certainty: the Apex Conquered had made a mistake. A human could survive with 10 rounds, a knife, and the will to endure. Mara Keen would prove it. The alien world was quiet at first light, but Mara Keen did not rest. She stood atop a narrow ridge, scanning the valley below with sharp eyes. Her movements were careful, measured, every step deliberate. The Apex Conquered hunters were searching, but their confidence had begun to falter. They had underestimated the human who could survive, adapt, and turn the hunt into a game of strategy. Mara had learned their patterns, their assumptions, and their weaknesses. Today, she would take the next step. The knife at her belt was light, her final tool if everything else failed. The energy rounds were nearly gone. She had fired just enough to create distractions, to manipulate the hunters, to keep them off balance. Each shot had been precise, careful, and purposeful. Now, with only 1 or 2 rounds left, she relied on intelligence, patience, and the environment. The Apex believed themselves unstoppable. Mara knew better. She crouched behind a rock, observing the hunters below. 5 of them moved cautiously through the canyon, their armored suits reflecting the pale light of the alien sun. They scanned every nook, every shadow, but their movements were slower now. Frustration was visible even in their posture. They had lost confidence. They had lost control, and Mara had gained the advantage. Mara had discovered something in the canyon, an ancient structure half buried in the red sand. Its smooth surfaces glimmered faintly, carved with symbols she did not understand. It was larger than any human building she had seen, and she suspected it could be used strategically. If she could lure the Apex hunters here, she could trap them without risking herself directly. Her plan was simple: force the hunters into a position where their strength became a weakness. She began to move, staying low and using every shadow, every crevice, every uneven rock to hide her presence. The hunters followed the false trail she had left for days, unaware that it led straight to the structure. Mara could see their uncertainty growing. They moved more slowly, communicating in quick, sharp clicks and hums, their coordination faltering. One misstep could separate a hunter from the group. That misstep was exactly what Mara wanted. As she approached the entrance of the structure, Mara examined it carefully. Large doors, partially buried, led to a corridor that twisted inward. The interior was dark, but the walls glimmered faintly with what seemed like energy lines. Mara realized the structure might respond to movement, pressure, or light. That was enough. She could use it without fully understanding its purpose. The Apex hunters relied on technology, but they did not understand the terrain as humans could. Mara's advantage was observation and adaptation. She positioned herself near the entrance, crouched behind a wide rock. She could hear the hunters approaching, their boots clicking on the sand, their sensors humming. She held her breath and waited. One step at a time, the hunters entered the narrow corridor. The first triggered a small mechanism Mara had carefully activated earlier. Loose stones fell from the ceiling, blocking the exit behind them. The hunters turned, momentarily trapped, unsure of how to proceed. Mara fired a single energy round into the rock wall beside them. It ricocheted with a sharp echo, confusing their sensors further. The hunters froze. Mara watched, calculating. The structure amplified every movement, every sound. It became a maze. Every wrong turn, every hesitation worked to her advantage. She did not attack directly. She guided, manipulated, and observed. The hunters were intelligent but predictable, and she was patient. Hours passed as Mara led them deeper into the structure. She used shadows, narrow passages, and uneven floors to separate them. One hunter became stuck in a corridor where the walls narrowed unexpectedly. Another triggered a small falling rock, forcing him to retreat and lose sight of the group. Mara remained calm, moving silently along the edges, never exposing herself. Every action was a test, a study, a lesson in survival. By late afternoon, the hunters were exhausted, confused, and increasingly frustrated. Mara had done more than survive. She had turned the hunters' confidence into hesitation, their numbers into chaos. She could see their movement slowed, their communication disjointed. Their advantage had vanished. The apex conquered, the so-called apex predators, were now trapped by their own assumptions and the terrain they did not understand. Mara paused at a high balcony within the structure, looking down at the hunters below. She knew the next step required precision. She had 2 energy rounds left. One was enough to create a distraction, the other to secure her escape if needed. She fired the first round at a pile of stones near a narrow corridor, sending a cascade of rocks tumbling down. The hunters split, some rushing to clear the blockage, others moving in the wrong direction. Mara smiled faintly. Their discipline was failing. She waited, watching their movements carefully. The hunters' sensors flickered as the structure reacted to vibrations and pressure. Mara realized she could use the building itself as a weapon, not lethal, but controlling. A small group tried to regroup near the entrance. Mara fired her final round into the floor near their feet. The echo was sharp, disorienting, and enough to make them hesitate. That hesitation was all she needed. With careful steps, Mara advanced through a hidden passage she had discovered earlier. It led to an open balcony overlooking the canyon below. From here, she could signal for human ships. She activated a small transmitter she had kept hidden, sending out a coded distress signal. It was not a call for rescue. It was a demonstration of human ingenuity, intelligence, and resilience. Any human monitoring the system would understand the message. A human had survived and turned the hunt into a lesson. As the signal broadcasted, Mara observed the hunters below. They had not noticed her escape. They were trapped, confused, and increasingly aware that they had underestimated her. The apex conquered had assumed humans could be hunted like prey. Mara had proven otherwise. Humans did not rely solely on strength or numbers. They relied on observation, adaptability, and courage. Minutes later, distant flashes of light appeared on the horizon. Human ships, drawn by the signal, arrived in orbit. The hunters noticed too late. They could not reach Mara before the ships arrived. She had survived the hunt, and in doing so, she had rewritten the rules. The apex conquered had underestimated the human spirit, and that mistake would be remembered. The ships landed in the canyon, and Mara made her way down to the extraction point. She moved carefully, never letting her guard down, but she felt a deep satisfaction. She had endured, adapted, and triumphed without needing to rely on brute force. Every decision, every observation, every step had led her here. The hunters would remember this day, not as a victory, but as a lesson. As the human ships lifted off, Mara looked down at the alien landscape. She thought about the days she had spent surviving, observing, and planning. She had started with 10 energy rounds, a knife, and the will to endure. She ended with the knowledge that humans were not easily defeated. Strength alone was not enough to survive. Adaptability, intelligence, and patience were the true tools of survival. The apex hunters would retreat, shaken and confused. They would tell their leaders about the human who had survived against all odds, who had turned the hunt into a game of strategy, and who had outsmarted them at every turn. Mara did not celebrate in loud words or gestures. She knew the real triumph was silent, personal, and absolute. Humanity had once again proven its strength, not in aggression, but in endurance and ingenuity. On the return journey to the human outpost, Mara recorded logs of her experiences. Every trap, every tactic, every observation about the alien terrain, and the hunters would be shared with humanity. These lessons were more valuable than any artifact or resource. They would ensure that no human would be caught unprepared again. The apex conquered had believed themselves apex predators. Mara had shown that intelligence, adaptability, and the human spirit could redefine the meaning of power. By the time the ships reached the orbiting station, Mara was calm but vigilant. She had survived an impossible challenge. She had turned the hunters' strength into weakness, their confidence into hesitation. She had proven that humans, even when outnumbered and outgunned, could endure, adapt, and triumph. The apex conquered would remember this. The universe would remember this, and humanity would continue to reach for the stars, confident in its resilience, its intelligence, and its determination. Mara Keen stepped from the ship, looking up at the stars. She thought about the hunt, the alien world, and the lessons learned. She had started with 10 rounds and a knife. She had ended with knowledge, strategy, and proof of human ingenuity. The apex had believed themselves unstoppable. Mara knew better. Humans survived not by relying on strength alone, but by using every tool at their disposal: brains, courage, patience, and the will to endure. And Mara Keen had endured. The apex predators left her with only 10 rounds and a knife, their final mistake.